far as just segueing into Iran, as far as Israel goes, we had a report last week that Jake Sullivan was speaking with his counterpart Eyal Hulata, the Israeli National Security Advisor. He's floating an idea to him for an interim Iran deal, where hypothetically, if Iran say stops enriching some uranium to 60%, enriching some uranium hexafluoride to 60%, the U.S. would release some Iranian funds or provide sanctions waivers for humanitarian goods. But Sullivan stressed that their sources in the Axios report say we're just brainstorming. This is only preliminary. But Hulata apparently turned this deal down. I don't think it's really a good deal for the Iranians, but I guess the Americans will have an opportunity to present it, and then we'll see what they say. That 60% enrichment is a big part of their leverage. And as I've pointed out before in my articles and on this show, like they only do that. It's a negotiating tactic. So the fact that there is concern on the other side about this means that it's ultimately that it's working. But when they go, well, we may release some of your frozen assets and funds, the Iranians maybe it was a month or two ago were saying, hey, why don't you unfreeze $10 billion in assets you've frozen as a show of goodwill before we return to the table? And the Americans refused. And I don't remember. I think it was the Germans who said as well that, like, oh, you better not do that to Washington. And it's like that is not – they're not going to – again, they're always looking for a way for Iran to essentially give up their leverage for not that much. And then what happens, if they don't get any further progress, or if the assets, the extent of the relief on of sanctions waivers on humanitarian goods, which is tenuous at best, because there's Human Rights Watch has put out studies about this, that basically, foreign banks and businesses and including medical companies and pharmaceutical companies, they're even, the idea is that the sanctions on humanitarian aid are waived, anyway, there's supposed to be, ways to do that. But these companies won't even try it because they over comply because of the fear of sanctions. Who knows how effective that would even be. So we'll see. But the Israelis want the Americans to, tomorrow is the IAEA's Board of Governors meeting. They want them to, and also the French are actually saying they should do this as well. But the Israelis want the Americans and the Europeans to really censure Iran for their, violations, or they're not living up to their obligations under the deal, or, being as cooperative with the IAEA as they believe that they should be. But of course, the French even said, like, you have to come through on you should recomply with all your obligations under the JCPOA and all of your commitments to the IAEA. But as I said, that Iran's not going to do that. First of all, they already did this extended monitoring deal that expired. The IAEA and Rafael Grossi can complain about it as much as they want, and America's allies can too, and Israel can, which is a joke because they have a clandestine nuclear weapons program and are subject to no IAEA safeguards whatsoever. And so, as far as that, reinstalling cameras at the site that was destroyed in Karaj in June by the Israelis in their drone attack, or further talks on the additional protocol, the snap inspections, that is, which the Iranians have ceased their voluntary compliance with until they know what the situation is with America, if they can expect any significant sanctions relief before they make the decision on that. You have all these different European countries and the Israelis and the Americans saying, pointing to this and saying that Iran is being intransigent, when they've even said, like, we're happy to have you reinstall cameras if you at least condemn the Israelis for attacking our centrifuge building site that destroyed IAEA cameras. But of course, they don't do that. Another thing I noticed in this Axios report is that they're basically talking to senior Israeli officials and different American sources who are close to the talks between Hulata and Sullivan. And one of the things that I noticed was that they said that – so we discussed, I believe it was last week, that Robert Malley, the envoy on Iran, would be traveling to Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain in advance of the talks. Not very subtle, but that's what they did. The Iranians were talking to the remaining members of the JCPOA. But anyway, so the talks that Malley had with Gantz, Benny Gantz, the defense minister, and Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, some of the details came out, at least in this report, according to this senior Israeli official that they talked to. They said that both Gantz and Lapid contended that the only way to get Iran back to the 2015 deal is to increase rather than loosen the pressure, which seems counterintuitive. But what's really troubling is it says Malley made clear that the Biden administration also thinks more pressure on Iran is needed. The main difference is over the timing of further steps against Iran, the officials said. So in addition to, let's see, we've got another report out of the New York Times. The Americans are saying that they find these constant Israeli sabotage attacks on Iran to be counterproductive, which so and the Israelis have said that they disagree and that they're not going to let up on those attacks. But they mentioned that in the report, they say that over the past 20 months, 4 different explosions at Iranian facilities have been attributed to Israel. And of course, as Dave DeCamp points out in this report, the U.S. at antiwar.com, the Americans have refused to condemn these attacks all the way through, providing tacit endorsement. And in fact, Blinken arguably has made explicit, has explicitly endorsed these actions and, framed them as self-defense. So the Americans have told them you should stop doing this because the Iranians are, building more and using, in small numbers, but still advanced centrifuges and, of course, increasing their uranium enrichment. But the Israelis say that they disagree and they're not going to stop. But as Dave points out, the Israelis, all the way through here, have been leading up to these talks, have been threatening to attack Iran. Practicing bombing their nuclear facilities, adding $1.5 billion to their military budget explicitly to prepare for an attack on Iran. And so all these actions are not meant to, bring Iran back into compliance with the JCPOA. If anything, they're meant to maintain the status quo or provoke a war. And, my contention is that, and I think there's good reason for this is something that goes back to the 90s, but essentially Israel relies on having the Iranian boogeyman as an excuse for the Americans to continue their relationship, the special relationship, as it's called, with Israel. So you have Gantz coming out and saying he wants a broader, stronger, and longer Iran deal that he says we need to dismantle their current capabilities, place effective inspections on sites and on weapons production. And I don't know if that's just, he's making up stuff about, nuclear weapons or not, but more ridiculous rhetoric. He says Iran is out for world domination, that their policy, their method is, he says, quote, Iran's method is simple. First, we take Damascus, then we take Berlin. And these are new reports that we've had, today. We have Naftali Bennett saying that the prime minister, saying Israel fell asleep after the JCPOA was signed. The mistake we made after the first nuclear deal will not repeat itself. From the moment the deal was signed, it affected us like a sleeping pill. Israel simply fell asleep on duty. We will learn from this mistake. We will maintain our freedom of action. And then you had the finance minister, Avigdor Lieberman, make further threats, saying Israel may just go ahead and attack without the support of its allies. Quote, we must make a decision alone, he says. Now, also in advance of these talks, we have the U.S. imposing more sanctions, new sanctions on Iran, accusing the Iranians of, election interference, which we first heard about this, I'd say, in the beginning of this year. And I remember seeing, people at CNN saying that sanctions were being planned for this on Russia, China, and Iran. At the time, I don't believe Iran was sanctioned for this, but now they are. Which is horrible timing, of course, and again signals that the Americans are not serious about, lifting sanctions or returning to the deal. But they're targeting 6 Iranian nationals and an Iranian cyber company, and they even sanctioned and indicted, the 2 of the individuals who were sanctioned were indicted by the Justice Department. And this comes off on the heels of America, Britain, and Australia. So I guess AUKUS. They came out and said that they issued an advisory saying that the Iranians are, basically conducting, like you said earlier, these ransomware attacks on Americans, or in America, I should say, and that essentially they're targeting, I think they said, the medical industry. Let's see. They say, yeah, transportation, healthcare, and public health sectors. When you read the reports and click through to the links, they're talking to Microsoft, who's saying that these hackers are exploiting their Exchange platform, which sounds very similar to their previous accusations against China, which again were not proven, but used to build further hostility with Beijing. And also, to potentially be used as for sanctions purposes. And also, we had even around that time, NATO and Biden saying that these cyber attacks that are usually without proof attributed to, you pick one, Russia, China, Iran, that these could be used as an excuse to trigger Article 5 or to go to war, actually. So that's very troubling. But they even cited CrowdStrike of all groups to say that, oh yeah, we've noticed a lot of this too coming from Iran. So they're using that as an excuse to build more sanctions. I found out another report in Responsible Statecraft that the chief negotiator for the Iran deal has further clarified what Iran's demands are going into the talks, and they are essentially that Washington lift all sanctions imposed on Iran, that the Americans compensate Iran for the damage done after Trump left the deal illegally and reimposed sanctions. They want to guarantee, again, that no U.S. administration will impose sanctions again, and that they also refuse to negotiate the missile program, their ballistic missiles, or their support for their allies in the region, and that before Iran returns to its obligations under the deal, they must be able to export oil and receive the proceeds as well. And again, in advance, we have more threats coming from the Biden administration. Lloyd Austin was just in Bahrain, again, of all places, threatening Iran, saying that he cautions that talks with Iran may not lead to a positive solution. And he says, quote, "We remain committed to a diplomatic outcome of the nuclear issue, but if Iran isn't willing to engage seriously, we will look at all the options necessary to keep the U.S. secure." There's more of the same rhetoric we keep hearing from Robert Malley, Antony Blinken, Joe Biden, not even thinly veiled threats to go to war with Iran. And he also said America will never allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. Of course, they're not seeking any at the moment or have in the past. And he said he criticized Iran for their, quote, dangerous export of drones to their allies across the region, as Jason Ditz at antiwar.com pointed out. And as we were just discussing about that sale to the UAE, which includes Reaper drones, in addition to the F-35s, they ignore the fact that the U.S. is exporting obviously much more. Reaper. There's a big difference between the drones that Iran it sends to its allies, those little suicide drones that are essentially, a science project in comparatively like a middle school science project compared to the Reaper drones that, the America has used in the wars of the last couple of decades.
And just to add to that real quick, Connor, I did read today that Israel accused Iran of attempting to launch one of those suicide drones, I guess, to land it in the West Bank. Question mark
back
on
in
how that would.
right?
No, I think they accused them of doing that today.
But
recently.
I thought it said okay.
Maybe you think that it came out today, but the incident happened.
They're saying this happened in 2018.
Oh, okay. I must have missed that part.
That's what Gantz said.
Yeah. Okay. All right. It really didn't make sense to me, but it did seem to build off of that specific claim from the U.S. that, Iran was exporting drones, which, as we already mentioned, if we want to talk about destabilizing powers, exporting drones, maybe let's look at Turkey before Iran, but never mind that conversation. Connor, what else is going on here?
I'll just say Austin also said our friends and foes both know the United States can deploy overwhelming force at the time and place of our choosing. So again, more threats. Let's see. So the IAEA put out a report last week, their latest report on Iran's stockpile and their nuclear program. They continue to complain that Iran is not complying with the additional protocol, but I already said, that's not going to change until there's a new deal. And of course, the stockpile is growing, as you've pointed out here on the show, and as Jason does in the article, because of American policy. the Iranians cannot export their excess uranium, and in exchange for so that it can be converted into fuel, because they can't access, international markets. So everything is the same. So the stockpile just grows. That's not surprising. And I've seen it reported differently in a couple of things, but yeah, basically they say it's about the stockpile, the enriched uranium of 60% uranium has grown to, I believe, 25 kilograms, which again seems to be about in keeping in pace with the rate we've seen the stockpile growing since they began to do this in May. Again, it's very small amounts, and just really to make a point that they want to disincentivize further Israeli attacks and induce some substantive diplomacy on the part of the Americans, and not continue the status quo where they're basically led around and sanctioned and attacked constantly. So let's see. Anything else? So yeah, I talked about the French. Rafael Grossi was in Iran today. He met with Iranian officials, and he said the agency, he's the chief of the IAEA, he says the agency is seeking to continue and deepen the dialogue with the government of Iran. We agreed to continue our joint work on transparency, and this will continue. The Iranian foreign minister, Hussein Amir Abdollahian, urged the IAEA to, quote, continue to cooperate with Iran in the context of its technical duties and avoid taking political positions, which I thought was very fair.
And I just want to mention, Karen, that his visit in Tehran came like within a week of him complaining, the IAEA complaining that there hadn't been a high-level meeting between Iran and the head of the IAEA since the new administration took over. So, this is showing Iran being willing to comply, and very quickly, particularly, with this being like a COVID situation and everything, getting the IAEA into Iran and meeting their demands.
Yeah, and he was saying all that stuff last week, and I believe we covered it because it was ridiculous, because he had met at least with the new Iranian nuclear chief in September. And like you said, the Iranians very quickly said, yeah, well, he's invited. We were waiting for his response, and this got done very quickly. And evidently, I'm sure the talks were relatively conciliatory because, the foreign minister made his point, but it wasn't like Grossi came back and said, oh, they're, being they're stonewalling me, or however it's portrayed in the American press and, by the Europeans. And the last thing I'll say is, because there's this is kind of ambiguous, but we have the naval commander of the IRGC saying that 9 Iranian soldiers have been killed in recent battles with American forces. He says that Iran was forced to prove that they will defend their sovereignty in the maritime areas. This comes off of this disputed incident in early November over a tanker, I believe in the Sea of Oman, where Iran claims that they thwarted a U.S. attempt to seize another oil tanker, which they've done many times in the past, particularly when they're sending oil to Venezuela in exchange for gold. The Americans have often seized these tankers and then, profited. They've sold the oil themselves. But the Iranians claim that they stopped them from doing this. Which, it sounds like they engaged the two different militaries here. The Americans said that the truth, they said they denied it. They said that the Iranians are trying to seize a Vietnamese tanker, but that hasn't been confirmed to my knowledge, and does not sound likely, actually, because, like I said, historically and even in recent history, what has been happening is America is seizing their tankers, or the Israelis are just outright attacking the tankers. So Alireza Tangsiri, who is, like I said, the naval IRGC commander, said that there's been a number of battles recently, direct battles, and that 9 of their forces have been martyred. He said, he added that the IRGC has made the United States realize the sovereignty, quote, the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic in the maritime arena. He did not mention the time of the clashes or how the soldiers were killed in, quote, direct battle with U.S. forces. And he said, for some considerations, some of the IRGC's confrontations with the U.S. forces have not been publicized in the media. So yeah, and there's been, throughout in recent months, actually, there have been more and more confrontations near Iran's coast with different American, like even Coast Guard cutters, I believe, that have where warning shots have been fired in different incidents like this that could, easily spiral out of control. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I would like to find out more about that, but it sounds like both the Iranians and the Americans are being careful to not, either the Americans are just denying it, or the Iranians are certainly being careful to withhold critical details. So, but it's still notable that it was even said.
Yep. All right, Karen. Well,